Hi there. I wanted to catch you up on what's the latest. I had another new discovery that I wanted to share that I'm really excited about. So, where I left off last, and unfortunately my battery died, so I didn't finish the episode, but where I left last was I um, started working with an organization around mental health. I discovered that my own mental illness, so my workaholism and my some of my bipolar tendencies are actually socially acceptable um, addictions or behaviors that got me promoted and accomplished in the 3D world, in the corporate world. And then I had visited a friend of mine whose daughter had severe, what looks like mental illness, like she's hearing voices and she's that are trying to harm her, or she's seeing people that are trying to harm her. And I had a really remarkable experience just being able to sense that and notice kind of the dynamic that was occurring. And then I ran into this organization that works with people with severe mental health, and they led me to a book, Neurofeedback for the Treatment of Developmental Trauma. And as I was reading it, there was just so much resonance in so many ways because I realized my own lack of attachment to the mother ended up making me lose sense of self and led to a lot of the unhappiness, discomfort, trauma, and things that like I struggled with, including not having a sense of belonging whenever I was in groups. Um, and a bunch of other things that manifested. But another one was like when I went to, and I mentioned in that one was underlying terror. When I went to my speed, so I tend to talk really fast, think fast, move fast, because that's a kind of a survival mechanism for anyone. If you're with a parent that has bipolar, the child will start moving and thinking fast as a self-defense mechanism, because if they don't, they can't get their needs met. So then when I started discovering that my speed has to do with my trauma, my initial thought was to slow down, but then the suggestion from the therapist was go to the speed, and that's when I was taken to an image of when I was a child, and I felt terror. I was at the edge of existence. And I recently bumped into a woman, another coach, when I was sharing this, said that she was adopted, and she actually had a vision, similar vision, where she was in the North Pole, laying in the snow as a baby, completely alone, and had terror. It was the same feeling. So I think that's resonant. They were talking about this in the book. Anyway, one of the things that they mentioned in the book was this notion of deep brain reorienting, which I mentioned in the last episode. But essentially, it's about it's in the brain stem, which is the back of the neck, and it's getting to the sequence of events that occur before the trauma, like sequence of events for the trauma, kind of cascades across the body and the system. The hormones and the digestion and all the things that get you ready for fight or flight. So, what it reminded me of was um, the head of the Santo Daime Church, Jonathan Goldman, where I have remarkable experiences if you want to check out any of their videos. But um, he wrote this book called Gift of the Body. And I read it because it was all about the energy system. One of the things that they'd mentioned that really caught my attention was this notion of the chimney. So the chimney is from the back of the neck up somewhere about, I don't know, a foot or two above your seventh chakra up here. And apparently it's like it's where energy can get stuck. Like, so if you're really sensitive and you have an antenna up, you tend to have an antenna up here that picks up what other people are feeling, thinking, what's happening in the collective, even if you're really sensitive. And what he was suggesting was that people that are the most sensitive can become psychotic because they're not able to, they don't know how to clear it. And then you'll start having neck issues as a common. I've had neck issues. I always thought it was a car accident I got into when I was right out of college. That was the reason for my neck issues. But I realized then, when I start looking back in time, whenever I go into a theta state, my neck would start moving. Whenever I go to MFR, myofascial release, my head would start moving to release it in my neck. And I always attributed it to my accident, which it might have been for some time. But what I realized was it was my system clearing the chimney. And then I was led to all these healing methodologies that allowed me to start clearing the chimney. And so the thing I wanted to share with you that was so interesting was, okay, that was one thing, DBR. The other thing was neurofeedback, what they talk about in the book. The idea that brainwave entrainment, and this is again something else that I've been led to and like discovered, and I think that's where I got cut off earlier, was so many years back, I want to say like 7-8 years back, there was a Mongolian shaman that came to Google, Corinne Sombrum, and she did a talk. She was sharing her research and she was sharing her, how she became this, and I was drawn to it. I never normally went to talks. This is one that I was drawn to. No surprise, no coincidence, but essentially, she talked about the cognitive trance state. And essentially, she was this BBC recording artist that went to Mongolia, had this like response when they started doing the drums or whatever, where she had involuntary movement. She felt like she had a muzzle, and she was like felt like a wolf. She felt paws, and it freaked her out. When the music stopped, the shaman came to her and said, "You're meant to be a shaman. You should come and work with us for the next 7 years." And she was like, "The hell I am." She went back to Paris. But then she started having these nightmares, and she started getting these visions, getting sick, and she realized that she needs to go back. So over the course of 10 years, then she went back every few months, became a fully fledged shaman, worked with a researcher who looked at her brain and found that, she went in the trance state. So actually, she couldn't actually go into trance initially because it required her to move around and stuff. And he was like, "I can't do I can't do a brain scan if you do that." So she goes, "I don't know how to get into trance without it." So he couldn't help her. She spent the next 3 years then trying to figure out how to go into that trance state without movement. And she was a sound recording artist, so she started piecing together different sounds that she thought might be the thing that got her into trance. And she discovered she created a soundtrack that would take her into the trance state, and they were able to do the studies and see that her brain was like Buddhist monks that meditated for like 30 years. And then she started experimenting, running groups and trying to help people to see what it could do. And there was a guy that came to her that had terminal cancer and couldn't move from the legs down. And he was trying all kinds of stuff to see if it would help him. Well, in the trance state that she took him in by listening to the soundtrack, he would actually move, his legs would move. And then she taught him how to go into the trance himself, and then he fully recovered from the cancer, and he attributed it to the cognitive trance, started a foundation. They've started an organization now called Trance Science that they're using to do a number of things, but including a long-term study they're doing to look at how to heal cancer. And she works with therapists and so on, and she's trying to see different applications for this cognitive trance. Well, I was so intrigued, I went and saw her while she was here at Berkeley, and I tried to listen to it, and I couldn't go into the trance state. And one thing she said to me, she said it to me later on when I was trying different things, but she said that sometimes if you're more left-brained you are, analytical, so engineers, psychiatrists, et cetera, it takes them, she said, up to 3 times to listen to the soundtrack before they go into the trance state. So I ended up going to visit her, and the interesting thing was when she went into trance state when the soundtrack was playing, I didn't go into it. I was just sitting there. I didn't feel much of anything. And when she came out of it, she said, "You didn't see anything? You didn't feel anything?" I was like, "Not really, nothing. I felt a toe twitch maybe, but that was it." Then she started speaking in French really rapidly to the woman she was staying with. And then I was like, what happened? What did you see? And she said, most of the time people are taken to their trauma, but they're in this calm place. So they're able to look at it, and then, they start to heal whatever way the system needs to heal. They'll start to heal that trauma. So she said, it's usually dark, and I usually go with them. I go to that same place. I see what they see. She said, in your case, though, there was all this light. There was a parade of animals. There was an ancestor that was speaking. I don't know if you heard me chanting, whatever. I was channeling her. And she was saying, you need to accept your gifts. And I was really skeptical. Honestly, this was quite far back before I started into this journey, really. And I said, so I asked her friend, I'm like, so does she, say this to most people? Is this a common thing? And she knew I was skeptical. She goes, no, she's only said it's one other person. I said, so what's the story with them? And they didn't accept their gifts, and now they have terminal cancer. I was like, oh, great. So if I don't figure this out, what are my gifts? She's like, I don't know. You're going to have to figure that out. So, and she said that she saw this image of me in front of some group or on a stage or in a crowd or something, and my hands were outstretched. And that's all she said. That's all she saw. And so I left, and then I kept trying to explore different techniques. I really accelerated exploring different techniques to see if I could figure out whatever this gift was. Never really, I was drawn to all these techniques that I now realize why I was drawn to them, and I was clearing the system of my trauma. So that, of course, was taking me down the path. But I ended up going back to Paris and, listening to the soundtrack. And on the second time of listening to it, I went into the cognitive trance. And what started happening was my head I was sitting on the couch, at her place, and my head started rolling. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not moving my head. And it what the hell? So then I kind of leaned back on the couch, and I was like, to stop, my head stopped rolling then. It wasn't forceful or anything. It just felt really pleasant to move it. And as soon as I leaned on the couch, it stopped. But I could feel it was wanting to go, but I stopped it. And then she came over, and she put my elbows up like this. Then my hands started moving. One went clockwise, the other counterclockwise, and I'm like, what the? And so I was wondering what was going on. And then she said, do whatever you feel like doing. If you want to lie down, you stand up, whatever feels natural to you. So I felt like standing up. I stood up. Then my head started rolling again. And after a few minutes, I started moving involuntarily now at the hip. My whole body was moving. Then it was my knees, around my knees were moving. And then what suddenly dawned on me is these happen to be all the areas I've had injuries. I fractured two ribs on my neck in a car accident. I injured my back when I was 16, and I tore my ACL and had to reconstruct. It still bothers me. And so these were, and then when I went back, I actually, like, they were improved. They weren't healed, but they were improved. I was like, whoa. So then I was like, I need to find out and she wouldn't release the soundtrack because she had done it at a conference and 80% of the crowd had gone into trance, but 3 people couldn't come out. She ended up going into the trance and being able to pull them out, but it scared her. And she realized, like many of these techniques, like psychedelics or even Vipassana, the 10-day silent retreat, if they're really powerful trauma, they bring your trauma to the surface. And if you aren't equipped to deal with it, it can take you into a psychotic state. You can get stuck in that state when the trauma comes up. And so that's kind of what I think might have happened there. She was able to pull them out. So if you have a strong healer or a co-regulative force, they can pull you out of that, depending on how strong that trauma is. So she was able to do that, but it scared her. So she, after that, refused to release the soundtrack unless it was through an organization or a therapist or whatever. So I was like on a quest then to figure out how do I get into that state. And one of my theories is I happened to be reading this book called Meditations to Rewire the Brain. And what they talked about in the book was different types of meditations are better for different types of people. So if you're someone, there are different brain waves. So there's delta when you're sleeping. Theta is when you're healing, or dream state. It's also a healing state that I discovered in my Vipassana journey. The Silva method talks about this is how they talk about quantum jumping, or they get into the theta state. And you can get that by right when you wake up is when you're in delta and you start moving up. If you pick up your phone, you get to a higher brainwave, but it goes through theta. Einstein and Newton would use theta to get ahas and scientific discoveries. So they would go to sleep, hold a steel ball. When they would fall, the ball would drop, wake them up, and then they would write down any insights that came to them. So that's theta. And alpha is like neutral. Often when you're meditating, you're trying to get to an alpha state. Then beta is when you're thinking, worrying, planning, etc., analyzing. That's beta. That's what we're in most of the day. And as soon as you wake up in the morning, you go through theta. But if you pick up your phone or start thinking, planning, whatever, beta kicks in, wipes out theta. So essentially, my theory was, in this book then, Meditations to Rewire the Brain, what they were talking about was like people who are anxious tend to have more beta waves, the fast brain waves. So if they do an observation style meditation like Vipassana, it brings them to alpha. If there's someone that's more depressed, so the guy that wrote it said he would tend to be on the more depressed side, and you do an observation style meditation which generates slower brain waves, he would go into narcolepsy, start falling asleep. So if he did some focus meditation that requires you to focus or concentrate, which generates beta, gets you to alpha. Then he looked at like ADD. So people that have ADD, it's because their body's not generating enough, their brain's not generating enough beta waves, so they're always like trying to, it's naturally activating them, like changing their, focus, and they fidget around. It's like the system trying to generate beta waves. So he found that with people with ADHD, if they did a focus style meditation, they would be able to get to alpha more easily. And he did PTSD, did these 4. So essentially, and it was through the meditation, but he also had mentioned, and I started discovering then, was like brainwave entrainment. So binaural beats, for example, if you listen to the brainwave. Oh, and one thing I'll mention about the meditation. So it's not about the meditation that is most comfortable to you, because what he found was like the one that's most familiar. Like if I have more slow brainwaves because I'm more depressed, I'm going to be naturally feeling comfortable with meditations that are more of that type, slow brainwaves. But what I really need is something that's not going to be easy for me to do, which might be a focus meditation, and vice versa. So actually, he has in the book, he has like a survey to figure out what type you are. You can try it out. The Finders program, Jeffrey Martin, he was a scientist that looked at people that achieved enlightenment and then identified, I think it was 9 meditation styles. And then in his program, which was originally 4 months and he dropped it down to 45 days, he would have people try all the different types, find the one that resonates the most, and then practice that for a period of time. And he was able to find great progress in terms of getting them to these like more enlightened states. And I think he found 70% in the first group, the 4-month program, 70% of people would achieve at least the first stage of enlightenment, which he describes these different states. And then in the 4 to 5 day program, it was 60 or 65% of people would get to that first state. So essentially, it's about finding the one that is going to help you get to that state more quickly, that alpha state. And I think if you want to do healing, it's even theta state. It's even slower than alpha. But so I started listening to binaural beats, and I started finding on YouTube binaural beats that would take me into the same state where my head would start rolling. So then I knew I'm getting into the theta state. And the reason my head was rolling is that the body goes into a natural healing state when you get into theta. So it naturally starts like, I think I was clearing this chimney that I mentioned as my first step, but maybe also healing the injury in my neck from the car accident. Um, and then I was moving the other parts that had injuries. But so essentially, it's like your body moves into this healing state. So in the book, coming back to the book now, um, one last thing. One thing that they mentioned that I learned from this Mongolian shaman, what she found was that when people went into the trance state, they would move in a certain way that would like help them heal. And she was like seeing all kinds of amazing healing that was going on with people with injuries and illness and disease and whatever. But they would start moving in a certain way. And she would record them, and then she would show them the movement. And if they did the movement, that would be like almost like a gateway to getting into that trance state, that cognitive trance state, into the theta state on their own without her and without the soundtrack. So what I noticed when I was doing the Thomas Hubel program a couple of weeks back is that they did this on body practice in the evening where they had us moving in a figure eight while we're standing. And that's where that was one of the areas that I started moving when I was in that trance state. So I think what it did was it took me into that theta state, and it kind of kicked me into this very relaxed state where I was kind of naturally moving to heal any trauma some of the trauma in my system. So the next day, for those of you that saw that video, in the Thomas Hubel program when he was doing these healings, really powerful, like he's a powerful source of co-regulation, a really powerful healer. So when he's so grounded and he's cleared so much of his trauma that he can co-regulate with, like, there were 500 people on the call, and certainly with the person that he's working with that asks a question. So everyone's, people's trauma, because you feel your subconscious feels so safe because of this strong co-regulative force, that your trauma starts to come to the surface. You feel safe. So then the ones with the most trauma are the ones that ask the questions, and you can see the terror and fear and on their faces. And then he essentially co-regulates with them, so they're agitated, their nervous system's agitated. Ours would naturally get, his would get, but then because he knows how to ground and stay grounded, they can then use that as a co-regulative force to ground, just like a parent with a child. Or you think of a baby, you rock them because they don't have a nervous system fully developed, so they use your nervous, you're helping them and this works with, TRE, for example, where, people who get stuck in a freeze-thaw loop or fight, flight, freeze-thaw loop. They can't come out. They don't have the resources for themselves. Their trauma's too great. They get stuck in that loop. This is what psychosis is. This is what severe mental illness is. They get stuck in that dimension. They get stuck in that loop of the trauma. But if you have someone here who's has can co-regulate with, they're grounded enough that they can actually handle this trauma. So the bigger the sankara, the bigger the trauma, the more powerful the healer would need to be, or the therapist or whatever, the co-regulative force. So if you haven't done a lot of work on self, you're going to get triggered immediately or eventually. So the more powerful the trauma, the stronger the trauma, the bigger the trauma, the more grounded I need to be, more clear my system needs to be, so that I can ground more easily and then transmute that and help them ground. So essentially, what he was doing then was, with these people that would come to ask the question, he would co-regulate with them, transmute that sankara, that trauma, and ground it out, essentially heal. That's healing. And then you would see the transformation on their face. They would suddenly get super relaxed, start laughing, smiling, like ease. You started seeing ease on their faces. And at the same time, all these people in the group who were all remote were also feeling it. So I started feeling tears, like I start crying. And, same thing with my friend who was there listening to it with me, would also start crying. And it was like, he wasn't saying much, Thomas Hubel. He would just maybe one or two words, but it was you could just feel it. And it was all happening remotely. So it was basically, the power of collective healing then. That becomes your entrainment, almost, your brainwave entrainment, because he goes into theta state in order to do that type of healing. And then as people are healing, because they co-regulate with him, they're going into theta state. So then, of course, brainwave entrainment, I go into theta state. And any resonant trauma, so when someone gets triggered and they're sharing, any trauma within my system, any sankara in my system that's resonant to that will also start vibrating, because there's a resonant frequency. And if I don't have the resources to ground, which is what we often see in most of our relationships, I get triggered, and then I reinforce their trauma and mine, and we keep reinforcing, we escalate. So that's why therapists can be valuable and healers can be valuable. People that are really able to ground and calm can now help you do the same. So this book was talking about brainwave entrainment, neurofeedback, as a way to get these kids or these adults that have had severe developmental trauma and have severe mental illness. Because the therapist, inevitably, a lot of them haven't, because it's such a great trauma, it's such a large trauma or sankara, they haven't cleared enough and aren't grounded enough. They're not a strong enough co-regulative power to be able to like help this person transmute and ground that energy. So they end up getting triggered. They get frustrated, angry, sad, scared, whatever, dejected. And inevitably that then reinforces the child or the patient, the client's trauma. So then and then they feel like they're dismal results. So that's what starts happening. So brainwave entrainment, she discovered in this book, Neurofeedback for the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, was that neurofeedback is brainwave entrainment. So you start playing these like binaural beats. You play these brainwaves like theta. Or they're doing alpha, I think. I haven't finished reading the book. It's that good. I only got to chapter 2. That they essentially then brainwave entrainment. So you go into a theta state, and then that's when they're able to start exploring things like DBR. So what was happening for me, and this is what started happening in my meditations, is that as soon as I started reading that book, and then discovering, like when I was in the sessions with Thomas, then after that, I would let my body. I would go into theta pretty quickly because I'd done the movement. As soon as I was allowing myself to do this movement, it was a gateway to me getting it more into the theta state, the cognitive trance. So then when he would work with someone, I would suddenly start feeling. Initially, it was somewhere in my body, my shoulder blade or my back. I'd feel like pain, tightness. Then I would just soften into it. I would be able to release it, ground it, and let it go. Then I started noticing it was all happening in my neck. And this aligned up with DBR, deep brain reorienting, where they say in the brainstem, the origin of the trauma, the sequence of events that occur before you're conscious of them are, happen there. And if you can get to that, become aware of it, because it manifests as neck and face tension. So whenever your system is alerted to like what might be a potential trigger, a trigger to trauma, your eyes will immediately your visual system goes on alert. And then you develop face and neck tension because it's like suddenly like on alert. So that's where it registers first before it cascades all the things that happen if you register as fight or flight and go into fight or flight. So I started noticing whenever he would start talking to folks, I start noticing it in my neck. And then I would just allow my body to move in a way that it naturally on its own to like remove that tension in my neck. And if I didn't do anything, the tension would stay there or would get bigger. And then if I allowed it to just move, I would like be able to release it. So then when I started doing my meditations and I was meditating on the plane, I meditated for like 3 hours. I put music on. I went into an even deeper theta state. Then I was just naturally moving, and it was almost like I was rhythmic. I was moving from side to side in different formats, whatever. And I was releasing like from the neck, but then even other parts like in my low back and whatever, second chakra, fifth chakra. I was releasing and then what I noticed was it would go back and forth, and then I'd click, like the chiropractic click. I would hear the crack. And then I started seeking the crack because that's what I wanted. So I'd push it a little further than, it was actually my system was wanting to go. And then I started feeling sore. And I realized like I was doing that thing again that I did at Vipassana, which was instead of letting go and letting my higher self, naturally move me in sequence that will most effectively heal the trauma, the sankhara, I was imposing control. My ego was kicking in, wanting to look for an outcome like a crack of the neck. And so then I was having suboptimal results because it's kind of like chemotherapy or using a hacksaw. In order to get to the sankhara, the trauma, I'm like destroying some of the good cells or some of the, healthy parts of it. And I'm almost like creating sankharas or traumas because I'm like pushing parts that don't need to be pushed. And so the way when I let go of my higher self, it's almost like following a thread. She'll move me in a way that like just gets to exactly the sankhara, unwinds, like you see unwinding, like in myofascial release. So there's no soreness. And I only get to it's like surgical versus like hacksaw or whatever. So when it started happening, I came back, then again, I suddenly wanted to meditate more in the mornings. I woke up. As soon as I closed my eyes, I started moving. I'm like, I want to meditate. What's this yoga now? And then I'm like, you know what? I should honor what's coming up. Let's just go with this. Maybe I'll meditate later. Then what occurred to me was, as I was moving, I realized what I need to do to get the optimal result is to be super focused on where my system is trying to move me. And it was a subtle signal. It wasn't like when I was in Vipassana, it was moving me really like with much more authority and force so that I would, release stuff and move in different positions. This was like really subtle. And what I realized was happening was the signal's been getting, and I thought before I lost the connection, or I lost the sharpness of the mind because I wasn't practicing regularly. And so that's why it wore off last time. What I realized was the signal went from gross, which is very concrete and like obvious, to becoming more and more subtle. And so then as my mind gets sharper, I can pick up more subtle signals, which is what you want to do, because then you can heal more trauma if you're able to get more and more subtle sensations on the body and feel into it. So then I realized okay, that's why it's subtle. Can I stay with it wherever it's trying to go, I keep my focus there without getting distracted. But then it also requires me to be fully relaxed so that I can follow the flow. I don't try to control it, push it, like accelerate it, you know? So I realize it's something I think called Turiya. I'm just reading about it in the Consciousness Sutras, which is also fascinating. But it's this idea that you want to be alert, but also relaxed. So it's like I forget what they call it, but essentially, this is the ultimate meditation then. When you're present, you're fully aware and fully present, and you're fully relaxed, you fully surrendered. And that's what I was starting to experience. And what I realized was, hey, what is meditation after all? Meditation is training your mind to go where you want it to go, whether you focus on a candle or between the eyes or a deity or whatever, your sensation. It's basically training the mind because it keeps getting distracted. Can you train it? That's all meditation is. So I am actually doing a meditation, and I'm also releasing sankharas, healing trauma, doing yoga at the same time. It's a 2-in-1. So I don't know if this meditation technique exists, but this is the one that I'm now doing, and it's amazing. So when I wake up, if I have any tightness, then I'm able to like clear. So okay, this is all context for the cool experience I had. So a friend of mine who's a coach, amazing coach, said that there's a woman who lives out near you in the Bay Area, who is kind of like struggling with embracing like some of the gifts that she has and kind of she's nervous about making it more public or mentioning it to more people or whatever. So I thought I'd introduce her to you. So I met her, immediately felt her, so I could throw off. I met her for lunch. All right. I met her for lunch, and the first thing she said to me was, she's like, I already seen some of your videos, and the one thing that struck me was that I realized I'm not able to do is, no judgment. So she said what's happening to her is she's going into freeze, not fight or flight, but freeze, like panic, basically. It's like it's a real extreme case of a state of fight or flight. It's past fight or flight, it's freeze. And she's like, when I go to public places, like, grocery store, post office, whatever, I'm getting into this freeze state, and it's so crippling. I can't do anything. And I'm like totally in panic mode. It's affecting quality of life. It's happening more frequently. And I have all this judgment around it that I can't seem to get rid of. And I've done all these healing methodologies, and they work temporarily, and then it all comes back. And immediately the thing that struck me was, I remembered from the book, Gift of the Body, that Jonathan Goldman wrote, about the chimney. And one of the things that he said is, if it's not cleared, and I was like, I shared this with her. I was like, if you're more sensitive, she's like, I'm very sensitive. So she's probably picked up a lot of stuff from environment, other people, etc., her own, and it's now blocked the chimney. So even if she processes trauma with all these different healing methodologies, they can't leave the system. So then I amongst other amazing things I discovered, like, I'll share one other thing that I discovered. So you might recall from the last video, I'm going to share what happened then with the chimney. When I was working with my friend's daughter, my hypothesis is that the shamans of the New World are going to come from people that we think are severely mentally ill, because they have really great gifts. They're highly, like I realized with her daughter, deeply intelligent, highly intuitive. And my guess is she's probably a shaman buried underneath all of that trauma. And when I was in the prisons, working at the Nehru Prison Project, I mentioned this in the video on that. These were like these individuals who, a lot of the people who end up in prison have had severely scary, abusive childhoods. And then their fears are so great, their autonomic responses are so violent, they end up in prison. And the ones that did the work, that went into their shadows and healed their trauma, were like enlightened beings. And I took a bunch of Googlers there, even, like, everybody felt like that was the safest place on earth and wanted to bring that back to Google. Like, how do we create that at Google was like the big question. We never could do it. But it was a really, like, example to me that the people that are the most sensitive, the most intuitive, the most gifted are the ones that are picking up the energy of the collective. They become psychotic, aggressive, violent, addicted. And then we give them meds and we throw them into like prisons and we throw them into mental health institutes, and then they get worse and they don't know how to work with or manage or, process what's happening, clear their systems. So that's my theory, that we're going to start to discover, and the shamans of the New World are going to come from that population. So this is something that I'd realized. So I'm meeting with this woman, and I'm telling her, she's telling me about the fear. So I'm trying to give her some perspective on like how to deal with this fear that she has, or the freeze, and how to not have judgment around it. So, I try to give some context, like this comes from a deep intelligence, that at one point in your life, maybe past life, this was a very intelligent response to survive that situation. And it's now in your system, and it may not serve you any longer, but it's still there. So if you can like honor it and accept it, that's one way to think about it, and then it's like you could try a deeper healing methodology, try to clear. And that's when she said she does, and she keeps coming back, so she's not able to clear. And then I was sharing how I discovered on my own journey, and this will have to be for another video, but it was essentially that when I started with the kids, working with the kids, I did this in my first video, why I left Google, but working with the kids and working through, tuning into the emotion, the sensation that was, in our systems, the patterns, emotional behavioral patterns we started seeing. Well, I really realized the power of that when we started having a series of personal traumas. And one of them in particular, I'm not going to go into it here, the video will get way too long, but one of them was when a dog had attacked and killed our puppy when my 14-year-old son was walking around the block with him. And it was trauma any way you cut it. It was gruesome, ended up getting attacked and killed. And both my sons were traumatized. And then we had defaulted to this process that we were doing, this bedtime routine. We were looking at, because we've been doing it for about a year and a half at that point, we naturally went to processing these emotions naturally in this. And it was really powerful. And I started to see, not only did they come out of that and without trauma and so resilient, they actually started teaching classes to other kids around how to deal with trauma. There was all these my son that was experienced it went on NBC and was because they, the whole community had risen up, and then he'd actually through the way he met the family, wanted to meet the family. We became friends with them. They gave their dog up for euthanization. They were grieving. It was like they had darling kids. Anyway, through my kids, my sons, I realized the power, the trauma became, what I realized was it was a perfect design for evolutionary growth. It was like a portal to consciousness. And if you're able to move through it, if you get stuck in it, you get stuck in that loop, either because you don't have the resources or no support around you to help you ground it out and move through what arises, then you can get stuck in there and you can end up with more and more mental illness. So I realized that there was a gift. And that's what I started seeing in the workplace too, that I mentioned there, was if I could honor what arose and not suppress it, I could start learning how to move through trauma, challenging experiences, toxic characters. And then I would move to the next level of the Mario Brothers games, how I describe it, where I would have more capability to handle bigger and bigger problems. I was starting to ride tsunamis, is how I described it. So I was describing all of this to her about how I started, and my life started becoming this unfolding mystery and great adventure, because I don't know what's around the corner, trauma or drama. What I knew was that it's perfectly designed for my evolutionary growth. If I can just honor what arises and surrender to the subconscious, which is vastly more intelligent than my conscious mind, connected to my higher self and conscience or whatever, vastly intelligent. So that's what started happening for me. And I was sharing this with her, and she was I could tell, getting really excited about this way of looking at the world. And I said, you know what? I bet on the other side of that freeze response you have are incredible gifts. Maybe even you're maybe meant to be a shaman. I'm feeling that. I could sense it, I could feel some of her guides actually sharing that with me. And then she just paused, and her face lit up. She had her dream, and she's been getting dreams about it since she was little, is that she's meant to be a shaman. So it was suddenly this total validation for me and for her about why we were even meeting, So then I was at the end, and I said, let me see if I can clear your chimney. I don't know if it'll work, and I don't know if I can do anything, but why not give it a shot? So I went behind her. We're in the restaurant sitting outside. There are not many people around. I figured, give it a shot. So I went behind her, and I'm like, all right, let me ground my energy. And I started, kind of trying to clear it from the back of her neck up, because I'd seen them do it in the Santa Daime church, and that was in the journey. And I'm like, I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I don't know if I'm actually doing anything, but whatever, let me give it a shot. So I did that for, I don't know, a minute maybe. And then I was trying to pull see if I could pull any of it out from the back of the chimney or whatever. So I did this, and I felt a little bit, and I was transmuting some of it, did a couple of rounds. Then I went to go sit. I'm like, all right, well, I'll leave it at that. There's a lot there, but, I did a little bit. Sat down, and then, I looked at her. Her face was flush. It was, pink almost, flush. She was beaming. She was smiling, beaming. She was like, I could totally feel that. I was like, oh. She's like, I feel she looked like she was in an altered state of consciousness. She was totally in the state of bliss or something. She's like, whoa. And then, she was just in awe. And then I gave her a big hug, and then we ended up, leaving. I'm like, keep me tuned on, what ends up happening if it helps you process any of it. So that's what I wanted to share, is that I think clearing the chimney might be one of the first places to start. And then starting to tune in, getting into the theta state. And one of the things she asked me was, how do you get into that flow state? So I'm going to share that in a different video about how to get into the theta state. And how do you raise your awareness? But I'm going to leave it there for now. Thanks so much. See ya. I just want to capture this on video because it's so cool. So basically, a friend of mine came over, and she's this, amazing doctor, super empathic, feels a lot like of sadness and fear about what's happening in the world. She's always been that way, and she's an amazing doctor. She's like really empathic and really like cares for her patients. And so she tends to absorb a lot. I can see that in her system. Like she's always got a lot of stress and pain and tension, and she does a lot of different healing methodologies, but like, to try to keep up probably with like clearing her system from all of these. So she had a couple of like really rough experiences happen the last couple of days. And then and so I'd heard that she had gotten into a car accident, and I reached out to her and said, hey, do you want to get together this weekend, or like, can I give you a hug or something? And she was like, yeah. So she came over and we walked, and then we came back. I was like, I could tell, like, you really seemed down. Your energy's really low. She was like, yeah, everything that's happening in the world. And then these things that have happened, and she had stuff happen with her kids. And I'm like, if you want, I was telling her about like what I discovered recently with like the chimney and like the energy that can get blocked in your system if it's not cleared. And like what I've been experiencing recently. So I was like, if you want to try it. And she was like, yeah, I'd love to. And she's always been up for like, being guinea pig and trying stuff out. So, we came into the yoga room, which I'm in. And so it's like, I grounded my energy, and then I like, cleared both of our energies, and then started, clearing, so I was clearing. I was sitting behind her. She was sitting on the carpet with me. And I was just clearing the back, the chimney. And I was clearing the fifth chakra from the back. And then I was using like tuning forks to break up the energy, any blocks that might exist, and so on. And as I was pulling it out, just like I had experienced in the, in the Santidami church when I learned it, but then since then, it's that I could do this and I could feel the energy that we wanted to come out, and then I could, transmute it through my heart and ground it into the earth. So I was doing this, and I felt a ton, behind her. I was doing it in the back of her neck, fifth chakra. I felt like a ton, so I kept doing that a bunch of rounds, and then I was doing the front, and then she said that, so I did it for a while, and then I'm like, what are you noticing or feeling? And she was saying she still feels like, tension in her neck, and like, she said her ear, interesting, she said when you were doing something in the back, and when I was doing, the clearing, she said her ears felt like they got really full. So I'm like, well, maybe we should keep going. So I did another round. I did the front, and I did the back of her, throat chakra. And then she said, now it's moved, like the fullness has gone away from the ears, and now it's between the eyes. So then, I was like, let's keep going. Kept clearing. Then she said it moved to the top of the head. This crown chakra now. And this is the sixth chakra. This is seventh chakra. So it came to the crown of the head. So I was sitting behind her, and I was like clearing up here. I was clearing the back and clearing the chimney. And then I was like, continuing that. And then I was like, and then she was like just noticing if things are shifting or whatever. And like my feeling was like the energy was now that the chimney was open, trauma was trying to leave her system. So she's starting to feel all this fullness in her ears, and then maybe it was blocked a little bit, so we cleared more. So then it's now moving into the sixth chakra. And then as we clear it, it's now moved to the seventh chakra. It's trying to leave. So maybe there's just a lot of it trying to leave, and that's why she was starting to get what she felt like was a headache. So I'm like, let's keep going. And then she said, okay, it got a little bit less and more centralized, and she was pointing to like the top of her head, which is the crown chakra. So then I on kind of on a whim, I felt like, well, maybe I should see if I can send her some healing energy. Like I've been taking a bunch out. Maybe the healing would help a little bit. So I just put my hand over here, like I'm sitting behind her, her eyes are closed. And I was like just holding it. All of a sudden, I could feel like heat emanating from my hand. Like I could feel, just like I did when I was in the Vipassana, I could feel the energy like heating in my hand, and I was just doing it from back there, like that. And all of a sudden she started like rocking or moving, and I'm like, what's going on? She's like, I can feel vibrations through my whole body right now. And then she said, I'm moving, and then I'm like, ooh, I like kept going. And I cleared some more, and then she was like, and then she started moving again as soon as I brought my hand back up. And then when she was telling me, she said that she started moving in a wave-like manner. And I think what happened was that she was co-regulating with me. And then I was also clearing stuff out and grounding it out for her. So she was moving into a theta state, so which is why she was starting to sway. And when we stopped, I was swaying, maybe to clear out anything that was still like moving through me, or when I was in that state. So, and then, she was like, whoa, this is so weird and so cool. And then she was like in awe, like I was, about the fact that there was even a possibility of having an effect on the body and the energies like that. So I had to share it, I had to capture it. It's so cool. Okay, we'll see where it goes. Bye.